In 1907, a coal miner in Scranton, Pennsylvania carried the same lunch pail into the shaft every single day for 11 years. The same meal, every day. His wife packed it at 4 in the morning before the sun came up, before the children woke, before the house was warm. That meal is number 8 on this list. Number 17 was so calorie dense that company doctors in West Virginia actually recorded it in medical reports, not because it was harmful, but because they could not figure out how men doing the hardest physical labor in America were staying healthy on so little money. Number 3 was invented by a miner's wife in Pennsylvania, who had not been to a grocery store in 2 weeks. She made it from what was left in the root cellar and a piece of salt pork the size of her fist. It fed her husband for 4 days underground. These 25 meals were never written down in cookbooks. They never appeared in restaurants. No food historian put them in a museum. They existed in lunch pails, in cast iron skillets at the edge of mine camps, in the hands of women who woke before dawn to feed men who might not come back up. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten meals miners actually ate underground, and the women who made them from almost nothing. Number 25. Hard bread and lard before the lunch pail. Before the thermos, before any of it. There was hard bread and lard. Miners in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania in the 1880s carried bread so dense and dry it could survive 3 days in a leather sack without going stale. Baked hard, twice if necessary until the moisture was gone and the crust could survive being sat on, dropped down a shaft, or buried under a jacket in the dark. A thick smear of lard went on top. Not butter, lard. Because lard did not spoil in the heat of the mine and butter cost 3 times as much. The combination delivered close to 800 calories in a single portion. For a man swinging a pickaxe in a tunnel with no ventilation and temperatures pushing 90 degrees. Those calories meant the difference between finishing a shift and collapsing before noon. A 5-pound bucket of lard cost 30 cents in 1885. The bread was baked at home from flour that cost even less. This was not a meal. It was fuel calculated to the penny by women who understood their husbands' bodies better than any nutritionist alive today. Number 24, cold bean paste sandwich. The beans were cooked the night before, not served hot. That was for the family. What went into the lunch pail was the leftover beans, mashed cold with a fork into a rough paste, spread thick between 2 slices of bread, wrapped in a square of cloth, and dropped into the bottom of the pail. Cold pinto beans or navy beans, mashed and salted, tasted like nothing extraordinary at the kitchen table. But 6 hours later, 200 feet underground, in a tunnel smelling of coal dust and black powder smoke, that cold bean sandwich was the best thing a man had eaten all day. The protein kept him going, the starch kept him steady, and the fact that it cost 4 cents to make meant a family of 7 could eat dinner the night before and still send a full lunch underground the next morning without choosing between the two. Mining families in Kentucky and West Virginia ate this combination. Beans at supper, bean paste sandwich at noon, so regularly that the routine became invisible. Nobody wrote it down because everyone already knew it. It was just what you did. Number 23. Onion and dripping sandwich. In the Welsh mining communities of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the dripping sandwich crossed the Atlantic with the miners themselves and never left. Dripping was the fat rendered from whatever meat had been cooked that week. Beef dripping, pork dripping, chicken dripping, saved in a small jar by the stove and allowed to solidify overnight into a pale, savory spread that smelled faintly of whatever animal had produced it, spread thick on dense rye bread with a few rings of raw onion layered on top and a shake of salt. The fat provided calories that no lean cut of meat could match. The onion provided sulfur compounds that miners believed, correctly as it turned out, helped protect the lungs against coal dust. Welsh miners ate raw onions the way other people took medicine. They did not know the biochemistry. They knew that the men who ate onions every day coughed less than the men who did not. Modern pulmonologists have since confirmed that certain compounds in raw onions have mild anti-inflammatory effects on the respiratory system. The miners figured that out in the 1870s with a pocket knife and a lunch pail. Number 22, cornbread and molasses. In the coal camps of Alabama and Tennessee, where black miners worked alongside white miners in the same tunnels for different wages, the lunch pail was one of the few places where the food looked identical. A thick wedge of cornbread baked the night before, wrapped in cloth, carried down with a small jar of blackstrap molasses tucked beside it. You broke the cornbread into chunks and dipped each piece into the molasses jar. The sweetness cut through the coal dust in your throat. The corn provided sustained energy. The blackstrap molasses, dark, thick, almost bitter, delivered iron and calcium that the company doctor's nutritional reports never accounted for. A pound of cornmeal cost 5 cents in 1910. A jar of blackstrap molasses cost 8 cents and lasted a week of lunches. For 13 cents, a miner had mid-shift fuel that nutritionists now recognize as one of the most mineral-complete, simple food combinations ever eaten by working Americans. The men who ate this did not call it nutrition. They called it lunch. They ate it sitting against the tunnel wall in the dark, their headlamps the only light, the sound of the mountain pressing in from every direction. Number 21, pickled cabbage and rye-bred Eastern European miners, Polish, Slovak, Czech, Hungarian, who came to the Pennsylvania coal fields in the 1890s and 1900s, brought this with them and never stopped making it. Pickled cabbage or sauerkraut made at home in large crocks in the cellar, packed into a small tin container with a tight lid, carried alongside thick slices of rye bread baked on Sundays to last the week. The acidity of the fermented cabbage cut through the heaviness of a morning of physical labor. The rye bread was dense enough to stay fresh in a warm, humid mine tunnel for 6 hours without going soft. The fermentation process that produced the cabbage also produced lactic acid bacteria, probiotics in modern language, that protected the digestive systems of men eating otherwise monotonous, low-variety diets. Miners who ate fermented foods regularly showed lower rates of gastrointestinal illness than those who did not. The company doctors noted this in their records without understanding why. The women who packed these lunches understood it perfectly. They did not need a laboratory. They needed their husbands to come home healthy, and they knew what made that more likely. Here is something the history books do not say plainly enough. The men who mined American coal, who pulled the energy that ran the railroads, heated the cities, and powered the factories of the Industrial Revolution, earned between $1 and $2 a day in 1900. Out of that dollar, they paid for their own tools. They paid for the powder they used to blast the coal. They paid rent on company-owned housing. They paid at the company store where prices were set by the same company that paid their wages. What was left for food was almost nothing. The meals on this list were not the result of poverty of imagination. They were the result of women performing an act of mathematical genius every single morning, calculating exactly how many calories their husbands needed to survive an 8-hour shift underground, and producing those calories from the cheapest possible ingredients, with no waste, no excess, and no margin for error. These were not poor meals. These were precisely engineered meals. The women who made them deserved more credit than the men who ate them, and the men who ate them deserved far more than they were ever paid. Number 20, salt pork and hardtack. When the week was bad and the pay was short and the company store had already been visited twice, what went into the lunch pail was salt pork and hardtack. Salt pork, a thick, heavily cured piece of pork belly, eaten cold, sliced directly from the slab with a pocket knife, alongside hardtack biscuits so dense they required soaking in water or coffee to be chewable. Together, they provided fat, protein, and enough carbohydrate to keep a man functional until the end of his shift. It tasted of nothing but salt and the faint memory of smoke. It required no preparation beyond slicing. It cost almost nothing and lasted in a lunch pail for days without spoiling in the heat of the mine. Men ate it without complaint, because complaining cost energy they could not afford to spend. They ate it looking at the coal seam in front of them, calculating how many tons they needed to cut before the shift boss came through, thinking about what might be on the table when they got home. Number 19, potato and fat pockets. In the iron ore mines of Minnesota's Iron Range, Cornish and Finnish miners brought a version of this from their home countries and adapted it to what was available in the American Midwest. A simple dough made from flour, lard, and water rolled flat, filled with diced raw potato, onion, and a piece of salt pork or fat, then folded over and crimped at the edge, baked hard in the oven until the pastry was stiff enough to hold its shape in a lunch pail without crumbling. No plate required, no utensils needed. You held it in your hand in the tunnel and ate it in 4 or 5 bites. The potato cooked inside the sealed pastry during baking, steaming in its own moisture, staying soft and warm hours after it left the oven. The fat melted into the potato filling, enriching it. The pastry itself was edible but secondary, a carrying vessel as much as food. Cornish miners called a version of this a pasty. Finnish miners called it something else, but every mining community in America that came from Europe brought some version of this principle. Food, sealed inside bread, portable, requiring nothing to eat it, sustaining a man through the hardest hours of his day. Number 18, coffee and bread. This is not a meal in the way a recipe is a meal, but it fed more miners more often than anything else on this list. Black coffee, carried in a tin pail or a heavy glass jar wrapped in cloth to stay warm, taken into the mine at the start of a shift. Thick bread, already stale from the day before, soaked briefly in the coffee until it softened enough to chew without effort. Eaten standing in the tunnel before work began, or sitting against the coal seam during a brief rest. The coffee provided caffeine, the only stimulant available to men who needed to stay alert in conditions that killed the careless and the drowsy alike. The bread provided carbohydrate. The combination cost almost nothing, and was assembled without any cooking beyond what the coffee required. Mining families across Appalachia, Pennsylvania, and the Mountain West ate this combination so consistently that it entered the daily rhythm of mine life the way tools and helmets did, as equipment, not as pleasure. It was not dinner, it was maintenance. It kept the machine running until something better was available. Number 17. Rendered tallow and potato cake company doctors in the West Virginia coal fields recorded this in their nutrition surveys of 1911 and could not explain why the men who ate it were performing at the physical level they were on the caloric budget they had. Cold mashed potato mixed with rendered beef tallow, the hard white fat processed from beef bones and scraps, cheaper than lard and longer lasting, formed into flat cakes, fried in a skillet at home in the morning, packed into the lunch pail wrapped in cloth, eaten cold 6 hours later underground. The tallow provided dense caloric energy, more calories per gram than almost any other food available at the price. The potato provided starch, potassium, and vitamin C. The combination, eaten cold in the dark, tasted of almost nothing. But it kept men cutting coal at a rate that surprised the company accountants who tracked tonnage against wages. The doctors did not understand it because they were measuring the wrong things. They were looking for variety and freshness and the markers of middle-class nutrition. They were missing the point entirely. The miners were not eating for pleasure. They were eating for output. The tallow and potato cake delivered output more efficiently than anything the company cafeteria ever served. Number 16, sourdough and bacon grease. In the western hard rock mines, the silver mines of Nevada, the copper mines of Arizona, the gold mines of Colorado, sourdough bread followed the miners the same way their tools did. A sourdough starter, kept alive in a cloth-covered crock, produced bread that lasted longer than commercial yeast bread, tasted better than flat bread, and required nothing but flour, water, and patience to maintain. A thick slice spread with bacon grease. The drippings from the morning's breakfast, saved in a tin cup beside the stove, went into the lunch pail alongside whatever else could be spared. The bacon grease provided fat calories that miners burning 3,000 calories a shift could not afford to skip. The sourdough provided the kind of slow-burning carbohydrate that sustained energy across long hours without the crash that sugar and simple starch produced. Miners in the Nevada silver camps of the 1870s kept sourdough starters the way prospectors kept their claim papers, as something irreplaceable, something that represented survival, something you did not lose under any circumstances. A man without his sourdough starter was a man who would eat worse tonight than he did yesterday. That was unacceptable. The starter stayed alive. Here's what the mining company histories never mention. The calories required to cut 1 ton of coal by hand, swinging a pickaxe, loading the coal into cars, pushing those cars to the shaft, burned approximately 5,000 calories. A miner, working a full shift, cut between 2 and 4 tons. He was burning 10,000 to 20,000 calories a day in the most physically demanding work the industrial economy produced. The food in his lunch pail contained, on a good day, perhaps 1,500 calories. He made up the difference at home. At supper, from a pot his wife had kept on the stove all day, from bread she had baked that morning, from whatever the root cellar and the garden and the pig they kept in the yard could produce. The meals on this list were not his whole diet. They were the part of his diet that had to survive 6 hours in a lunch pail in a mine tunnel. Every ingredient was chosen for its ability to survive heat, delay, and darkness without becoming inedible. Every combination was chosen for maximum caloric density at minimum cost. This was food engineering performed without instruments, without education, without any of the resources modern nutritionists take for granted. And it worked. The men lived, the families survived. The coal came out of the ground. Number 15, dried apple and cheese. In the lead mines of Missouri and the zinc mines of the Ozarks, miners' wives dried apples in late summer specifically for the lunch pail months ahead. Thick rings of apple, dried on wooden racks in the sun until the moisture was gone and the rings turned leathery and dark, carried in a cloth sack alongside a wedge of hard cheese, the cheapest available, purchased in blocks from the general store and aged in the cellar until firm enough to cut without crumbling. The combination was simple to the point of embarrassment. Dried fruit and cheese. But it provided vitamin C at a time when fresh vegetables were scarce, calcium from the cheese, natural sugar from the apple for quick energy, and enough variety in texture and flavor to make the meal feel like something more than pure survival. Miners who carried this reported in oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project that the dried apple and cheese was the part of the lunch they looked forward to. Not the bread, not the salt pork, not the coffee. The dried apple and cheese. Because sweetness underground was rare, and rarity in those tunnels felt like luxury. Number 14, cornmeal and salt pork cake. Not a dessert cake, a survival cake. A dense, flat round of cornmeal mixed with water, salt, and crumbled salt pork, pressed thin in a cast iron skillet and cooked until firm enough to hold its shape in a lunch pail for 6 hours. This was the Appalachian coal miners' version of the portable meal. Corn instead of wheat, salt pork instead of lard, because salt pork cost less and provided both fat and a trace of protein in a single ingredient. The cake was dense, slightly gritty, intensely salty, and completely reliable. It did not go soft. It did not fall apart. It sat in the bottom of the lunch pail and waited And when the man pulled it out in the dark 6 hours later, it tasted exactly as it had when his wife packed it. For families in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia, this was a Tuesday meal and a Wednesday meal and a Thursday meal. It was not special. It was not celebrated. It was simply what kept the shift going, what made the tonnage possible, what allowed a man to swing a pickaxe at 2 p.m. when his body wanted to stop. Number 13, pickled eggs. The company stores that operated in most American mining camps of the late 1800s kept large glass jars of pickled eggs on the counter beside the salt pork and the crackers. A single egg cost 1 cent. 2 eggs were enough protein to sustain a man through 4 hours of hard labor. Eggs pickled in a brine of vinegar, salt, and sometimes beet juice, which turned them deep purple all the way through. Did not require refrigeration, survived days in a warm lunch pail without spoiling, and provided complete protein in a form that required no cooking, no preparation, and no utensils to eat. Miners carried 2 or 3 pickled eggs alongside their bread and their salt pork, eating them in a single bite each, their sharp vinegar bite cutting through the coal dust that coated everything underground, including their taste buds. The acidity made them taste alive in a way that salt pork and cold bread never quite managed. Women who kept chickens pickled the surplus eggs every week. Women who did not kept a running account at the company store's egg jar. Either way, the pickled egg was the most reliable protein source in the American mining lunch pail for nearly 40 years. Number 12, fatback and biscuit. In the Deep South's coal and phosphate mines, Alabama, Tennessee, the Carolinas, fatback and biscuit was the meal that crossed every racial and economic line in the mining camps. Fatback, the pure cured fat from the back of a hog with almost no lean meat, sliced thick and laid between 2 cold biscuits baked that morning from flour, lard, and buttermilk. The fat provided an extraordinary density of calories in a small package. The biscuits provided carbohydrate and the particular comfort of bread that tasted like someone had cared enough to make it from scratch at 5 a.m. A pound of fatback cost 8 cents in 1915. The biscuits cost almost nothing beyond the labor of making them. The entire lunch pail cost less than 15 cents. And yet it carried a man through an 8-hour shift in 100-degree tunnel heat, doing work that would have destroyed most people who had never done it. The women who made these biscuits before dawn, who had packed this same lunch for 10 or 15 years, who could produce a dozen biscuits in the time it took the water to boil for coffee, those women are the uncredited engineers of the American mining industry, not the company owners, not the engineers with their degrees, the women at the stove before sunrise. There is a silence in American food history where the miner's kitchen should be. You can find books about the cuisine of the American South. You can find histories of immigrant food. You can find academic studies of working-class eating habits in the industrial Northeast. But the specific food culture of the mining camp, the lunch pail, the root cellar calculation, the woman who fed her husband on 12 cents a day and kept him alive and working, that story has almost entirely disappeared. It disappeared because the people who lived it did not write it down. They were too tired. They were too busy. They were feeding children and tending gardens and keeping chickens and rendering lard and pickling eggs and baking bread and packing lunch pails at 4 a.m. and then doing it again tomorrow. The food companies that replaced this culture did not replace it with something better. They replaced it with canned goods and packaged bread and the suggestion that cooking from scratch was something women should want to leave behind. Some of them did want to leave it behind. They had earned that right. But what was lost when they did, the knowledge, the precision, the extraordinary skill of feeding a family on almost nothing, that loss was permanent. These 25 meals are what was lost. This video is what remembering looks like. Number 11, potato soup in a jar. On cold mornings in the winter mines of Colorado and Wyoming, when the temperature at the surface was below 0 and the tunnels were only marginally warmer, miners carried hot potato soup in sealed glass jars wrapped in cloth to stay warm as long as possible. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water, salt, a spoonful of bacon grease, cooked at home in the morning, ladled into a jar, sealed tight, wrapped in whatever insulating cloth was available. By the time a man reached the bottom of the shaft and found his place at the coal seam, the soup was still warm. 2 hours later, it was cold. It did not matter. He drank it anyway, straight from the jar, the thick, starchy broth coating his throat against the coal dust. This was the first soup thermos, built not from technology, but from necessity, from the understanding that a warm meal underground was worth whatever extra effort it took to get it there. The glass jar was returned to the lunch pail at the end of the shift, handed back to the wife who washed it and refilled it the next morning. The jar traveled down into the earth and back up again, every day, for years. The same jar, the same soup, the same hands that packed it and the same hands that emptied it. That continuity, that daily loop of care between the surface and the dark, was the real meal. The potato soup was just the medium it traveled in. Number 10, rye bread and head cheese. In the iron mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where Finnish, Swedish, and Cornish miners worked alongside each other, head cheese, the jellied meat made from the scraps of a pig's head, appeared in lunch pails every week without fail. A piece of head cheese the size of a man's palm, laid on thick rye bread with a smear of mustard if available. The gelatin that held the head cheese together softened slightly in the warmth of the mine, making it easier to eat. The rye bread stayed firm long after white bread would have gone soft and stale. Head cheese cost almost nothing because butchers in 1900 had no other market for it. The scraps that produced it, the ears, the snout, the cheeks, the tongue, were the parts that customers with money would not buy. Mining families bought them because they could not afford to be selective. And what their wives made from those scraps was something that provided more complete protein per penny than any other meat product available at the time. Modern food historians now call nose-to-tail eating a culinary movement. The women who made head cheese in the mining camps of Michigan in 1905 called it Tuesday. They were not making a statement. They were making lunch. Number 9, boiled egg and salt. The simplest meal on this list. The one that required the least preparation and the least cost and appeared in more mining lunch pails more consistently than almost anything else. One boiled egg. A small twist of paper containing salt. That was it. An egg boiled hard the night before, cooled in cold water, slipped into the lunch pail beside the bread and the salt pork. Eaten in 2 bites, the shell peeled off underground in the dark, the white firm and cool and completely satisfying in its density. The yolk chalky and yellow and providing fat and protein in a package that cost 1 cent and required 30 seconds to prepare. The boiled egg fed miners across every coal field and hard rock mine in America from the 1870s through the 1940s. It required nothing beyond a pot of water and a few minutes of boiling. It survived in a lunch pail all day without spoiling. It provided complete nutrition in its most concentrated form. There is nothing simpler. There is nothing more honest. And there is nothing that better represents what the mining lunch pail actually was. Not a meal for pleasure, not food for comfort, but precise, calculated fuel packed by a careful hand at 4 in the morning for a man who needed it to survive. Number 8, the standard pail. This is the meal the miner in Scranton carried every day for 11 years. 2 thick slices of bread, the heaviest, densest bread his wife could bake, not sandwich bread. Real bread with a crust that held, spread with lard or bacon grease. A piece of salt pork, 2 boiled eggs, a small jar of cold coffee. A wedge of cornbread if the week had been good. No variety, no surprise. The same meal, the same pail, the same order of eating. Bread first, egg second, salt pork third, cornbread last if available, coffee throughout. He knew where everything was in the dark without looking. He could pack his own pail if his wife was sick, and it would be identical. The routine was not monotony. The routine was efficiency. Every calorie was accounted for. Every cent was justified. Every item had been tested across years of shifts and selected because it worked. Because it kept him upright, kept him cutting, kept him coming home. When he retired after 30 years underground, his wife was asked what she thought her most important contribution to his career had been. She said, the lunch pail. Not the love, not the children, not the house. The lunch pail. Because without that, she said, none of the rest of it was possible. She was right. Number 7, smoked fish and rye. In the copper mines of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the iron mines along the Minnesota Iron Range, Finnish miners brought smoked fish into American mining culture, and it stayed for decades. Smoked lake trout, or smoked whitefish, fish caught from the Great Lakes in summer and smoked over alder wood until the flesh turned dark and dry and salty, wrapped in cloth and carried in the lunch pail alongside thick rye bread. The fish lasted days without refrigeration. The smoke acted as a preservative. The salt in the curing kept spoilage at bay, even in the warm, humid tunnels of an active mine. The omega-3 fatty acids in the fish supported the neurological function of men, making constant split-second decisions in dangerous environments. The protein was complete and dense. The salt replaced what a man sweated out during a morning of hard labor. Finnish mining families smoked fish in late summer and stored enough to last through winter. The calendar of a Finnish mining household in 1910 was organized around the fish, smoking the way other calendars were organized around harvest or planting. The fish was not luxury. The fish was infrastructure. It was the protein bridge between what the family could afford fresh and what the man needed underground. Number 6, vinegar pie. Here's the one that surprises people. Here's the one that does not belong in a list of survival food, but is there anyway because miners wanted sweetness the same way everyone wants sweetness. Desperately when they cannot have it, and gratefully when they can. Vinegar pie, a custard made from eggs, sugar, vinegar, flour, and a bit of vanilla if available, baked in a thin pastry shell and carried to the mine in a tin. The acidity of the vinegar mimicked citrus. The eggs and sugar produced a custard that sat firm enough to cut and carry without crumbling. The whole thing cost 8 cents to make and lasted 3 days in a cool lunch pail. Mining wives in the Appalachian coal fields baked vinegar pie on Sundays when the week had been good enough to allow sugar. Men carried a slice into the mine on Monday, as a reminder that there was a Sunday, and that there would be another Sunday, and that whatever the mountain was doing to them today, it had not yet taken everything. Sweetness Underground was an act of defiance. The women who packed it knew that. The men who ate it knew that. Nobody said it out loud. They did not need to. The pie said it for them. Number 5, bean and fatback. Stew in a jar. The heavy jar again, because for cold weather shifts in mountain mines, the only hot meal a man would eat between 4 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon was whatever his wife had sealed in glass and wrapped in cloth. Pinto beans cooked the day before with a piece of fatback. Thick, fatty, falling apart after hours of simmering. Ladled into a jar while still hot. Sealed immediately to trap the heat and the steam. Wrapped in a wool sock or a piece of old blanket. Carried into the mine and eaten 4 hours later while still faintly warm. The beans provided protein and fiber. The fatback provided fat calories that no lean meat could match per penny. The combination, eaten from a jar in a dark tunnel with a spoon, kept specifically for that purpose and washed at home every evening, was the closest thing to a hot dinner that underground work allowed. Men who ate this reported in mining oral histories that it was the meal they thought about during the hard hours of the morning shift. The jar sitting in the bottom of the pail, still warm if they had been lucky with the wrapping, waiting for the moment when the shift boss called the midday break. Something warm, underground, in winter, in the dark. That was not just food. That was the reason to keep going. Number 4, crackling cornbread. When the family rendered lard, melting down the fat from a hog slaughtered in November, the crispy bits left behind in the pot were cracklings. In a mining household, nothing that came from the rendering pot was thrown away. The cracklings went into the cornbread. Cornmeal, water, salt, and cracklings folded into the batter, which was then baked in a cast iron skillet until the top was golden and the bottom was dark, and the whole loaf could be sliced into wedges and carried in a lunch pail for 3 days without going stale. The cracklings added fat, added protein, added the deep, smoky flavor of rendered pork that made plain cornbread taste like something a man could eat 6 days in a row without losing his appetite for it. They added texture, little pockets of crunch in every slice that broke the monotony of starch and bread and starch again. Mining wives across Appalachia made crackling cornbread every November and December when the hog was slaughtered and the lard was rendered and the cracklings were too valuable to waste. For 2 months, the lunch pail contained the best bread of the year. For 10 months, it contained the memory of it. Number 3, root cellar soup. The widow in Pennsylvania who invented this, or the version of it that her grandchildren remembered, had not been to a general store in 2 weeks when she made it. What was in the root cellar? 3 potatoes going soft, 2 carrots losing their crunch, half a head of cabbage, a piece of salt pork the size of her fist, dried beans from last summer's garden, an onion, water from the well, salt from the bin, everything into the pot. 4 hours on the back of the stove. What came out was not a recipe. It was a calculation. Every vegetable that was about to turn unusable, rescued at the last possible moment and transformed into something her husband could carry into the mine in a sealed jar for the next 4 days. The soup tasted of everything the garden had produced and everything the root cellar had preserved, all of it concentrated into a broth so thick and rich it was closer to a stew. The beans thickened it. The cabbage sweetened it. The salt pork gave it depth that no single ingredient could have provided alone. 4 days of lunch from ingredients that were days away from being thrown away. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. The mathematics of survival do not allow waste. They allow only precision. And that widow, with nothing but a root cellar and a soup pot, was more precise than any chef has ever needed to be. Number 2, molasses and bread. Not molasses on bread. Molasses and bread, 2 separate things eaten together, traded back and forth between bites, the way some people eat bread with soup. A thick slice of day-old bread, slightly stale. A small tin of blackstrap molasses. The dark, bitter, intensely mineral variety that cost almost nothing because it was the byproduct of sugar refining, the part the sugar companies could not sell to middle-class customers who wanted their sweetness light and gentle. Miners ate blackstrap molasses because it was cheap. They kept eating it because it worked. The iron in blackstrap molasses, a single tablespoon contains nearly 20% of a man's daily iron requirement, prevented the anemia that plagued hard labor workers who could not afford red meat. The calcium and magnesium supported the bone and muscle function that mining destroyed over decades. They did not know any of this. They knew it was sweet. They knew it was cheap. They knew that a man who ate it regularly seemed to hold up better than a man who did not. The molasses tin was the last thing packed into the lunch pail. The first thing opened underground. A man who started his shift break with something sweet, however small and however bitter, started it believing the rest of the day was survivable. He was usually right. Number 1, bread and water. This is not the number 1 spot because it was the best meal miners ate. It is the number 1 spot because it was the most honest. Plain bread. Water from a tin cup or shared pail carried to each workstation by a water boy, a child usually, 8 or 10 years old, whose job was to carry water through the tunnels to the men cutting coal. The bread was whatever was in the pail. The water was whatever was in the pail. On the worst weeks, when the pay had not come and the company store account was over its limit and the root cellar was empty and the garden was still 3 months from producing anything, this was what a man ate at midday. Bread and water, not as punishment, as fact. The men who ate bread and water at noon and swung a pickaxe for 4 more hours afterward were not superhuman. They were desperate. They were fathers. They were men who had made a calculation at 4 in the morning when they shouldered their tools and kissed their wives. That today they would go down, and today they would come back up, and tonight there would be something better. And most days there was, a pot on the stove, a family at the table, the bread and water forgotten by morning. But some days there was not. And on those days, the bread and water was everything. It was the whole meal. It was the whole day. And the men who ate it without self-pity, without performance, without any of the language we now use to describe struggle and hardship and resilience. They just ate the bread. They drank the water. They went back to work. That is the meal that built America, not the steakhouses, not the restaurants, not the dinner parties of the wealthy industrialists who owned the mines. The bread and the water, and the man eating it in the dark, 200 feet underground, keeping the whole machine running on almost nothing. Remember that. Remember them. The challenge. Make one of these this week, just one. The potato soup in a jar, 2 potatoes, 1 onion, bacon grease, water, salt, costs less than $1 and takes 30 minutes. Seal it in a jar. Carry it somewhere. Eat it away from your kitchen. Understand what it means to eat the meal that was designed for a different place entirely, or make the bean and fatback stew, or the cornbread and molasses combination. Eat it the way miners ate it, plain, without ceremony, as fuel rather than pleasure. Then come back and tell us what you tasted. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if the vinegar pie surprises you. I want to know if the pickled egg and salt sounds too simple until you actually try it. And if your family came from a mining community, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, West Virginia, Minnesota, Arizona, tell us what your grandfather carried in his pail, because these meals are not in any cookbook. They are in the memory of the people who ate them and the descendants of the people who packed them, and that memory is running out of time. These were not forgotten meals. They were deliberately overlooked by food historians who preferred prettier subjects, by companies that needed people to buy what they were selling, by a culture that decided that surviving on bread and salt pork and molasses was something to leave behind rather than something to honor. This video honors it. Share it with someone whose family worked underground.